Hi everyone, it's Mrs. Wine. Welcome back to art class. Today we will be starting a brand new unit, and today we will be learning about a new art style. So the question that we want to ask ourselves and hopefully be able to answer by the end of today's class is, what is Cubism? So let's get started. This week, our learning target says, I will learn about Cubism and create a sketch of a self-portrait. So the first thing you have to know is, what is a self-portrait? You should know it's a picture that you make of yourself. And the question that we want to be asking ourselves is, how can I use other artists as my inspiration? So take a look at this self-portrait. Do you think the artist was trying to make this picture look like he really looked? Is it in a realistic style? That gives us our first clue about Cubism. Cubism is not going to be a realistic art style. It is going to be an abstract style. So even though we can tell that this is a person, it does not look like a real person. And today what we're going to start with is, each one of you is going to have a different artwork to look at. And while you're looking at that artwork, I want you to ask yourself some basic questions that we always want to start asking ourselves when we're exploring new art. The first thing we start with is, what do I see? How can you describe the artwork using the elements of art? What kind of lines do you see? What kind of shapes do you see? And what kind of colors do you see? After you've started with the first three main elements, take a look at the last four. Do you notice different values? Different textures? Probably not form, because form is three-dimensional, and today we are only looking at drawings and paintings. And do you see any sort of use of space? Is the artist trying to show you objects that are close and objects that are far away? Or does the space seem pretty flat? Then, once you've looked at the elements, you want to start to ask yourself how the artist is putting those things together. That's the I think part. And it's kind of like making an inference. We're using what we see with the elements of art with what we already know to try to figure out what the artist is telling us. What do you notice? You can answer that by saying, it looks like, because you always want to give us a reason. What does this make you think of and why? It reminds me of, because. And what is the artist thinking, and how do you know? I think the artist wants us to see, because. And then finally, when you first start to look at an artwork, you're not going to know everything about it and everything about the style. So that should still probably leave you some questions. I wonder, can you explain? Or another question I have is, so in class, we are going to take time to examine the work of art a little more closely. And then once you've had a time to really explore your work of art, we're ready to move on as a group. The first Cubist artist that we are going to learn about is Pablo Picasso. He was born in Spain in 1881. And Pablo Picasso is the artist who started this style of Cubism, along with a friend of his, Georges Braque. He is considered the greatest and most influential artist of the 20th century. And he died in 1973. Let's take a look at some of Picasso's Cubist portraits. What do we notice when we look at these? One thing I start to notice is I notice that there are all these different lines, a lot of them straight, some of them curved, but they really start to break up the space that we are looking at. So one thing Cubists were trying to do was sort of look at things from different angles all at once. That's why you might notice things like the eyes don't quite match up, or maybe one eye looks like it's sideways while the other eye looks like we're looking at it straight on. So this idea of breaking up and fragmenting areas is something that Cubists did. At least that's what Picasso's doing here. Let's look at some more. The artist Juan Gris was another Spanish artist. He was born in 1887, just a few years after Picasso. And before he studied art, he actually studied engineering in the city of Madrid. Then he moved to Paris and he began to seriously paint in 1910 and started to develop his own Cubist style. Gris died in 1927, so he had a much shorter life than Picasso. But let's take a look at his style. So again, I see that idea of things being divided by straight lines. But with Gris, those lines aren't always harsh and dark. Sometimes those lines are almost invisible. But still, it's that idea of the nose looking like it's broken into several pieces, and an eye turned one way while the mouth turns another way. Look at this drawing by Gris. Here, it's almost like he divides the space or fragments the space using different squares and different rectangles. And then again, we see that the facial features like the eyes don't quite match up. And we're looking at the nose from several different points of view. It almost reminds me of looking at your face in a broken mirror. Another artist that was influenced by Cubism is Roy Lichtenstein. He was not Spanish. He was born in New York in 1923. And then much later, he was influenced by Cubism in the 1950s. His work was also influenced by comic strips, and he became a leader of the pop art style. Lichtenstein died in 1997. Let's take a look at some of his artworks. I definitely see the influence of comic books in these striped pattern areas and these little dotted areas. It reminds me just like the comic strips in the newspaper or like comic books that I most often think of when I think about reading about superheroes. But look how look how Lichtenstein divided his space. Again, here we see straight lines, rectangles, and we see that things are really mixed up. Here I'm looking at someone's profile, while here I'm looking at an eye looking sideways. The ear looks like it's where the nose should be, and the mouth is all out of place. I also see that he included some texture for the hair. But things definitely don't match up. In this, it looks a little more realistic, but it still has that idea of the face being fragmented or divided by different lines, showing us those different angles of the face all at once. Now, these three artists are not the only artists that have been influenced by Cubism. Here are two examples of professional artists that have been influenced by Cubism. Notice some of the same traits: patterned areas, areas being divided into straight lines and angles. And here we can see students influenced the same way. Look at how these students have borrowed their ideas from these Cubist artists. I see facial features that don't match up, dark lines that fragment or divide the face. I see different patterns in the hair, the clothes, and even on the face. Here I see patterns in the background, and I see that the nose almost looks like two pieces of a puzzle that you're fitting together, with one eye to the front and one eye to the side. I also notice in many of these that color is used in a way that is very, very abstract because people's faces don't have all these different colors. One other interesting fact is that I have a relative who was a famous artist. Her name is Grace Martin Taylor, and she was also influenced by Cubism. My family went to see an exhibit of her works several years ago. Now, although she didn't do portraits, she did still lifes or objects. And you can see by looking at these pictures how she still is using that idea of lines to divide up the page. And you can't quite tell whether the violin is in front of the bottle or the bottle is in front of the violin. I just thought it was interesting as I started studying my own family history that I have a connection to Cubism. So here's what we're going to be doing in this project. We're going to be practicing drawing our own portraits. Then we're going to be thinking about how we want to divide the space on our paper, either with straight lines or with simple shapes. Then we're going to be drawing our portrait in that Cubist style, working to fragment things and show them from different angles at the same time. We will be adding some patterns to some of our areas to create interest. And finally, we'll be choosing a color scheme that we want and working to add color to our artwork. So this week, we're going to start studying our faces just as Cubists did. Even though each of these artists eventually worked in a Cubist style, before they started working in Cubism, they were trying to look at things how they really looked. So this week, everyone is going to draw your best self-portrait in a realistic style. Now, more than even working about getting the proportions correct, what I want you to really focus on is really look at what your facial features look like. You can look in a mirror, you could look at a large photo of yourself, or you could use your device, turn on the camera, and look at your face that way. But I really want you to take a close look and examine what your eyes look like, your nose, the shape of your mouth. What kind of lines do you see when you look at your hair? And do you have any other interesting features in your face that you think would be interesting to include in your portrait? Don't get too caught up in trying to make your face look perfect. This week is just for practice and just to get us to slow down and really look. When you're finished with your portrait, you can take a photo, send it to me in Google Classroom or on Dojo. And then next week, we'll be ready to take our realistic faces and start mixing them up in a Cubist style. Have a wonderful week and keep on creating.